Professor Mostafa Minawi is an associate professor of history at Cornell University and the director of the Critical Ottoman and Post-ottoman studies. He is the author of the Ottoman Scramble for Africa, Empire and Diplomacy in the Sahara and the Hijaz. I hope I didn't butcher that completely. As well as the very recent Losing Istanbul, Arab-Ottoman Imperialists and the End of Empire. His short video, The Rise of the Ottoman Empire, he made with TEDx, has almost 1 million views on YouTube and is just the coolest introduction into the history of the Ottoman Empire. Professor Minawi, welcome to Eurotrash.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very happy to be here.
As I say in nearly every episode of this podcast, my guiding light is my ignorance. But in this case, my extremely limited knowledge, if we can even call it that, of the Ottoman Empire comes with a specific flavor. I'm from the Balkans, and the Balkans have, how should we call it, a stormy relationship with the Ottoman Empire, as most of it was conquered. So a lot of our folklore obviously portrays the Ottomans as the ultimate Disney villains, you know. I remember growing up reading children's stories about how, they said the Turks are coming and abducting kids and taking them to distant lands. Old people would still say, you better behave or the Turks are coming and they're going to get you. That kind of level, yeah. And unfortunately, the school didn't do much to counter this very binary image. I don't think we even covered the Ottomans in our history class, which is a little bit odd, given the proximity and the history. Now, I understand why these kinds of stories would get kind of burned into the collective psyche, because probably there was some generational trauma there, but it doesn't make it easy to understand the history, right? So I was thinking that in this conversation, we would kind of go through different images or cliches that usually occupy our imagery and clear them up a little bit, separating fact from fiction as much as we can. I'm afraid that for you, this conversation might be extremely basic, like I said before.
No, this thing, and I love doing that. I mean, really, I really think of scholarship as something that's supposed to reach, particularly people that were a part of the Ottoman Empire, because, by the way, what you just described is not limited to the Balkans. It's very much in the rest of the Arab world. And I would argue, even in Anatolia, they're taught Ottoman history, but a limited version and a very kind of Turco-centric version of Ottoman history. So the Balkans are not alone.
Okay, well, that is already something that is extremely new to me and refreshing to hear. I thought it was just the Balkans. So here we go. That's a perfect start. We certainly don't have the luxury to cover like 6 centuries of the Ottoman Empire, but we have to spend like a minute or two with the founder of the Ottoman Empire, Osman I, right? The story goes that Osman dreamt of a tree growing out of him, covering the entire world in its shade, which means he kind of foresaw, the story goes, his future empire. How did he manage to, or maybe first of all, what was the situation in Anatolia during his life in the 13th century?
So that's a perfect question. So I love actually talking about what Osman's dream. There's a whole textbook that's written in English, and I think it's been translated to several languages by Cornell Fleischer, and in which there's a full kind of narration of the dream. And I make one of my students stand up in the middle of a class, usually more than one, and narrate it as if they are talking, kind of telling a story of mythology. Usually I get someone who is an orator or someone who does reading of religious text, either in temple or in a church. And it is, and I think that is the context in which it should be taken. It is very much meant to be a mythology that is supposed to, in retrospect, imbue Osman and thus the Ottomans with a religious aura, a sense of a divine, which happens in all empires at that time. It's of a divine mission that they did not choose, but they were chosen for. To expand, and to encompass the world under their shade. That is what the tree is about. But let's break it down. Osman was the emir, or the ruler, or the bey in Turkish, Emir in Arabic. Both of them were used at the time of something called a beylik, or an emirate. If you're thinking of the United Arab Emirates that we understand today as little kind of, that's what was happening during the time of Osman. There was several beyliks all over Anatolia of similar or equivalent strengths. And what made Osman's beylik different than others is where we spend a lot of time kind of trying to, in retrospect, look at the little clues as to why were they so successful when others were successful, but definitely not as successful. They didn't turn their beylik into an empire and a global empire within 200 years or so. During that time, the Ottomans were very much doing what the other beyliks were doing, which is they were trying through alliances as well as through force to maintain what they have and expand their wealth. It's that basic. We can put a religious veil over it. We can do whatever we want to do over it. But in reality, when you look at what was happening at the time, the Ottomans were not shy to align themselves with different Byzantine rulers, whether it is the emperor or the pretenders to the throne, as well as others. And also, they were not shy to use the help of mercenaries that are both Christian and Muslim as well. And sometimes when that worked for them, and they were not shy about attacking other Muslim emirates in Anatolia along the side of again either Byzanto-Serbian or Byzantine rulers. Most of their wealth came from there. It came from lending, selling their services as warriors. And
Also, kind of mercenaries, almost.
mercenaries, very
Okay.
much. It's so the whole reputation of what we think of today, and it's usually not said in a good way, but the violent Turk, or it comes from this idea that when a lot of these people that were 2 or 3 generations in, just arriving from outside of the region. So of course there was about a century or so of more than a century actually of Turkic tribes coming from Central Asia. And we believe that Osman's tribe, or his father, came in with a second wave of migrations that came from Central Asia, and they were known as being semi-nomadic or nomadic tribes that were fierce fighters and brave fighters, and so that reputation that they cultivated, and that reputation they cultivated themselves, because that's really how they made a lot of their living. And how they gained power, and also how they had a vision of how they would expand. So mercenaries is one way of putting it, but it's absolutely would be one of the major ways that they gain power and wealth. But mostly it's strategic thinking. It's really kind of knowing when to align yourself with whom, where, and for what purpose is what would kind of tip the scale in their favor, as opposed to other beyliks, other Turkic beyliks that were in Anatolia at that time. I can go on and on if you wanted to stop.
So basically, he was a really shrewd politician and soldier. Is that what we're saying?
He was a very shrewd politician that ruled over who collected taxes. By the way, paid taxes to the Seljuks still at that time, but he came in at a time when there was. It's like that generation immediately that after the Mongol invasion, essentially that caused kind of a bit of a vacuum, a power vacuum in Anatolia that allowed a lot of these Turkic tribes or tribal confederations to establish their own autonomy. All along, kind of either paying taxes at times to the Seljuks, at times whatever is left of the Seljuks that were themselves paying taxes to the Ilkhanates, who were leftover Mongol empire, or paying taxes or tributes to the whatever is left of the Byzantine Empire. So they were in between those two major empires, but there's enough vacuum, there's enough political and power vacuum for them to assert themselves as autonomous emirates, or that were expanding often at the expense of each other.
So how much time did it take Osman to go from being kind of like a semi-vassal to these different proto-states or whatever to become to founding an actual empire?
So the founding of the actual empire, even though of course it's called the Ottoman Empire, it's after him. It could have been named after his father or or his grandfather, both of which have great TV series that are made in Turkey that are very popular. About, of course, it's all imagination. We know nothing about them. We know very, very little about them. But he did not establish an empire. He is credited with the name of the empire. In reality, it's if we start to think of an empire as something that is or at least an emirate, as established with a capital, we really have to go to his son Orhan, where we see like a coin kind of struck in his image, and we have architecture from his period that survives in Bursa, the first Ottoman capital, and so on. So it's really his son. But when we think about the Ottomans as a global empire, that really comes much, much later, once they establish their capital in Edirne or Adrianopolis, where they start to threaten beyond they start being a regional power and become kind of more of a global power. By the time we hit Istanbul or Constantinople, we'll talk about. Please, let's talk about the difference between the names at one
Please,
point.
let's do it right now so we clear it up. So we've
But
resolved this.
It's very important that people understand. It's one of my biggest pet peeves is that people think that when you say Istanbul, you're taking a side, or you're stamping it as Turkish or as Muslim, or you're ignoring the fact that it's a Constantine.
Really, that's still a conversation these days?
It's still a conversation. I have to do this every time with my students, and
somebody actually says, "I'm going on a vacation to Constantinople." That's an actual thing.
Yes, very much. There are people. Let me tell you, when I'm writing articles in which I talk about Istanbul as Istanbul, I always get some reviewer somewhere, usually from Germany, who is like,
"Why am I not surprised?"
This is not historically accurate. He's obviously biased, and like, just really. So let me clear this really, which I do almost in the first. I play that song Istanbul, not Constantinople. That from the cartoon, and then I go, They are both valid, and they are both Greek. There is nothing Turkish about the word Istanbul. It really comes from Istanbul, which means like going to the city, spoken in Greek dialect of that time. In many ways the Ottomans, in their writing of the chronicles, they would use mostly Constantiniye, which means literally Constantinople, and that's the official name of Istanbul for a very long time. Under the Ottomans, every once in a while Istanbul would come up, but it's never as an ideological dig. It is just another kind of casual way of saying the city. For my students, I give them an example of, if you live in Brooklyn and you want to go to Manhattan, you don't say, "I'm going to Manhattan." That sounds really weird. That means you're from New Jersey. If you have to, you say, "I'm going to the city." Right. So it's that similar adoption of the locality, if you will, like the familiarity of the capital, the city, that they adopted. Very late in 19th century, every once in a while they would call it Islambul, which is Islambul, but which bol, in Turkish, means a lot. So it's like a lot of Islam, but that is not the official name of it. That's someone who's trying to make, like, a pun on Istanbul. That's it. So let's just clear that. They're both Greek. You can adopt both of them, and nobody who knows anything about the history of the region would think that you are a Turkophile or an Islamophile, right?
Oh wow! Again, I didn't even know that this is a debate, but I'm happy that we cleared it up. So during the expansion, was it the Sultanate, or is it the empire already, or how should we call it?
I love those questions, man. I just know these are really important questions because terminology matters a lot. So it's very much, it remains an emirate until the title Sultan, which by the way was only the first time you hear the title Sultan used is through the first Seljuk Sultan was given that title by the Caliph, who was the Abbasid Caliph at the time, who was essentially just a figurehead, by then a quasi-religious figurehead, even though he's not a religious, learned person. But let's just call it kind of the Caliph, the Abbasid Caliph gives the Seljuk, the head of the Seljuk Empire, and then later the word Sultan. So eventually, which literally just means the ruler or the person with authority. You can tell immediately if it's your person with authority. That means your authority was given by someone, like to say that you're the deputy, if you will, by in this case the caliph. So when the caliphate disappears with the Mongol Empire, a lot of these people would call themselves either emir, bey, or sultan interchangeably. Sultan would take you up to the level of the Seljuks, which would cause issues with the Seljuks, but eventually the Seljuks disappear as they their power disappears, and who calls themselves sultan becomes only important when the Ottomans start to have to compete with other major Muslim empires.
Okay, since we're here, the difference between sultan and caliph.
A caliph, originally a caliph was literally meant nothing but the successor to the prophet, right?
Yeah, so it has a more religious connotation as well, right?
That's because people associate it with the days of the prophet, yes.
Okay.
So by the time we get to the Abbasids, which is many centuries later, essentially a political, a caliph is supposed to be the head of the a Muslim empire, and that word caliph comes because you're supposed to imitate as much as you can the prophet, so you are literally the successor of the prophet. Now, the only ones that we think of as real successors are the first four that were, think of them as the apostles, like they were around when Muhammad was around. After that, it becomes a sultanate or an empire, the Muslim empire, and they adopt a lot of the Byzantine notions of inheritance of who becomes the successor of one emperor after another, but they maintain the word caliph as a way of saying that it's a Muslim empire. The caliph is not a religious scholar or a religious holy man, never will be, never is. So by the time we get to the Abbasids, though the title caliph, because their power has essentially been stripped, the Seljuks find it more useful for them, instead of replacing the Abbasids, is actually using their clout with the Sunni population to say that no, the caliph is still sitting up there, and he gives us the sultan, the power to rule over you in his name, but in reality they are the ones that are ruling. That's why you see maps from the Seljuk period where you see some maps which show it as an Abbasid empire, even though it's the Seljuks that are effectively in control, and some maps particularly later on would show it as a Seljuk empire without the Abbasids being there, because the caliph was nothing at that time until the Mongols come and he gets kicked out, and we believe his descendants end up in Cairo. So that is the difference. So sultan. So what's interesting with the Ottomans is that they would not acclaim the title caliph until they conquer what I call the Arabic-speaking majority lands, which is the Eastern Mediterranean into the Hijaz and all. So I wish I could. Yeah, the Eastern Mediterranean into North Africa and down into the Hijaz, into Saudi Arabia. And the reason they do that is that there is this whole story in which they are competing with the Mamluks that they take over
in Egypt,
and they
right?
say in Egypt, right? And the Mamluks are another Sunni empire. They're of Turco-Circassian origin as well. So there's so much commonality, if you will, with the Ottomans. But they have to find a way to justify conquering another Muslim empire. By the time we get to that point, the Sunni religious justification as legal justification becomes very important. But that's all the way out in 1512, 1516. Before that, religion is lovely and we can talk about it, but practicality overrides everything. By the time they have Istanbul, the establishment of a global empire, a new Rome, if you will, that happens to be ruled by Muslims, is how they frame it. But then, just like the Byzantine had to have a religious establishment that the Ottomans start then to say, no, we're not just another empire that happens to be Muslim. We are the Muslim empire.
And that happens only at that point.
Yeah,
Later
yeah.
on. So, but if we can stop here just a little bit, how did they justify conquering other, especially Muslim empires and peoples up until
It depends.
that point?
Early
Because they were also Sunni, right? So how would you, what would they tell themselves to like make it okay that we're subjugating all of these people who are also Muslim?
So that's the thing. I spend a lot of time asking students to understand the difference between a ruler or a state or a dynasty that very much is Muslim and is not like they're faking their Islam, but does not necessarily do everything because they are Muslim, one, or because of Islam, and thus have to justify everything because of Islam. So the distinction is different. It only becomes important when they themselves are writing their own history much later on, centuries literally into the 16th century, or where they start to have to tell the story. So we get, the story of the tree coming out of, Osman and him being next to a holy man. All of these religious, they're very raison d'être has to be justified through religious means because their sites are put on a much larger empire, and they want to compete with other empires that are claiming the mantle to Catholic, they're the the Holy Roman Empire, but also competing then with the Shia, Persian, Safavid Empire.
So you have to have a glorious narrative.
Exactly. You cannot just and at that point, law. An empire that is centralized through a legal system becomes incredibly important, because up until then it was like, do your own thing, collect our taxes, more or less. I'm being oversimplistic here.
Yeah, of course.
But by the time we hit from Mehmet on, from the conquest of Istanbul and the generation after him, they need to have a legal system in which they can law. And remember, legal systems, that means in this case it would be a mixture of Central Asian traditions, which they still held on to, but also Sharia, form of Sharia, an interpretation of Sharia. There's no such thing as a Sharia. You know what I mean? But it has to be, they have to be setting the rules. And so that is the only time. So the earlier on doing things like conquering other Muslim beyliks, they don't need a justification.
They're just like, this is how it is right now. This is the times. We're conquering each other. We don't need a special justification. Absolutely. This is one warlord against the other warlord. This is the way of the world.
And you can later on say that we did this because they were heretics, or we did this because they were not good for the public good or the survival of Islam.
But it's always in retrospect, right?
Always in retrospect. Now,
that's so fascinating.
The major difference happens, it's a kind of a substantial difference happens after Mehmet II, when there is a building up of this establishment. There's also religious schools are being established, universities, if you will, in Istanbul that are supposed to compete with established universities that in Cairo, particularly with Al Azhar, that is under the control of the Mamluks. And at one point, it becomes it's you or us. There's no us living together, and we have to establish ourselves as the Muslim empire. Mamluks, that is when you get a fatwa. You know what like a religious opinion, the head of the religious establishment, to say it is kosher to go after other Muslim Sunni empires, and we'll tell you why. In the past, they didn't need to tell anything. The Sultan would just, it's about survival. It's about this is what is done. Here, by the time we hit 1512 and 1516, going after the Safavids or going after the Mamluks has to be religiously justified, even though it's like big loopholes in the way they justify it. The fact that the Sultan would have to go to Shaykhul Islam, like the head of the legal kind of pyramid, in Istanbul and work closely with them, which is where the closeness between the state and the religious establishment starts to happen in the Middle East, unfortunately. But working with them to justify actions such as attacking the Mamluks, such as attacking the Safavids, also such as, remember, they're doing things that are not kosher in Islam. For example, going into a town that surrendered, you're not, and if they're people of the book, that means if they're Christian or Muslim,
Jews. Yeah.
or Jews, sorry, or Jews, you're not supposed to take slaves, including the children, which they've done for many centuries by the time we hit Mehmed, which is with the collection of the Defshirme, the Janissaries, that I'm sure what you started the talk with about them collecting, having saying that from a specific town we
Yeah.
need this many children to take with us, so we will train them and to become basically they become the backbone of the administration. That is still slavery, enslavement, and that was not kosher by Islam. So if they were really following Sunni, you're literally not allowed to do that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought that kind of slavery, I may have it all wrong here, please correct me, but that it was a common practice in the Ottoman Empire
Very
that when you
much.
conquered other peoples, you took slaves if they were not Muslim.
No, that's a great. So
That's
that is where.
okay.
So no, that's so slavery was very much practiced,
Yeah.
and it continues unfortunately to be practiced in different ways. Our North American audience will think of slavery in the transatlantic sense. It is very different kinds of
From
slavery.
chattel slavery, it's different, right?
Exactly. So there's different kinds. There's the Defshirme, the collection
Yeah.
of these kids that they bring them and then they educate them and they become viziers in some cases. In some cases, they become accountants. They're converted. They themselves will own slaves. So it's a whole other. They're only slaves to one person, by the way, and that is the Sultan. And it's important to keep
So
that
it's
in mind.
like state-owned slaves.
The state owns slaves, Sultan owns slaves. So the
Yeah.
Sultan has the right, the death and life right over you. But otherwise, your life is actually you're living an elite, established part of the upper layer in which you don't pay taxes, all of that stuff. That doesn't mean it's not enslavement. It's very much enslavement. So slavery. There are other kinds of slavery. There is chattel slavery. There is sub-Saharan slavery that comes like there's different kinds that was practiced in the Ottoman Empire. In some cases, all the way until the end of the Ottoman Empire, which I talk about. I mean, illegally, but still. And all the way till the very end, which is part of what I talk about in this more recent book, which was shocking to me, but very important to talk about, I thought. The reason I'm saying all this is there. But having said that, there are legal and illegal ways of obtaining slaves, according to if you are following strict Sharia, particularly Sunni jurisprudence, right? So you can, if you conquer a place and they did not resist, which means you did not fight with them, you have no right to take to pillage and take slaves and whatever. They are Christian. They're dhimmi. Dhimmi means the protected, right? So you're supposed to protect them because now they are part of the state, and in exchange for that protection, they pay a head tax. Of course, they're second-class citizens. They have to pay a head tax to be protected. I mean, I'm not. This is not some utopic existence. But so a lot of these villages that they took those kids from, they did not resist. Most of these villages do not have. A military. The people that resist are the people in one specific spot. Usually, it's owned by a feudal lord or something like this.
Yeah.
So most of these people that were there, you just go into a new village where now these are the taxes. In most cases, they make the taxes more favorable than what they had before, because in the expansion period, you do not want rebellion. You don't have enough boots on the ground to maintain people by force. So what you do is adopt what the Muslims did a long time ago when they were expanding, which is you make things as favorable as possible for the local population, so you don't have to worry about them rebelling when you're still expanding, moving forward with your army. So except when it comes to so it's a big exception, this taking a few. You usually have a specific number that you take, and there's a lot of debate that after about 100 years of this practice, which was horrendous, but unless you think about the relationship between children and parents as very different, in the early modern period than it is for us. What I mean by this is that do you think of your children as workers for you? Of course, you take care of them, or do you think of them as this notion of childhood, which is a very 19th century, and the notion of adulthood and the relationship in like nuclear family, of course, didn't exist. What I mean by that is that we don't know at what point do people actually want to give their children up so children will have a much better a life, and then send money back, build churches where they came from, and so on if they do well, and how much of it was by force. It is enslavement. Let me just make this very clear. I'm not saying this as I'm trying to complicate our modern notion of things that we take for granted, to just make sure that people understand that it is a lot more complex in the way it operated. Of course, we can definitely have moral judgment over it now, but it was a lot more complex in the way it operated, in the sense that enslavement, both kosher, I keep saying kosher, I mean, both religiously, legally justified, and those that are not legally justified, was very much practiced. And then when the legal system was well established, there's challenges to that, to doing.
As a slave, could you eventually become free?
Of course, as a slave, depending on what kind of slave you are, you can be manumitted. But that's usually like the lower ranked slaves. What I mean by this is that people that work in fields, people that work mostly in households, they are supposed to be manumitted at one point. Now, the defshirme is a whole other system. It's essentially we take you in, we convert you.
Okay, let's talk about it right now, because that's what my question anyway, because it's probably the juiciest source of Ottoman lore in the Balkans are the Janissaries, or as we call them, Yanichari back home. We were told that these young kids were mostly from the Balkans, but probably not. Were taken at a young age, raised as Muslim, and then turned into these elite infantry soldiers. In our stories, they were always soldiers, not administrators. And these fantastic stories usually convey a mix of fear, in a modern sense, of kids being taken from their parents, but also pride because they became somebody in the empire, right? The classic arc is then, of course, some Serbian janissary who would then become the Grand Vizier,
Yes.
What was the reality, though?
So
you talked about it a little bit already.
That is not too far off. What I mean by this is that, but you collect like thousands of children. How many of them will become viziers? Let's just So yes, absolutely. For a period, most of the viziers were initially like from, let's say, Constantinople on, like from the conquest of Constantinople on. The viziers are majority Muslim Christian converts. But they're initially as adults. What I mean by this is that they're Byzantine, ex-Byzantine or ex-Serbian lords that are brought in. They convert. Usually, you can tell from their name, because they would have to, like, their first name becomes Mehmet, but their last name would be Angelovich, so it's not, but, and they don't lose their ties, of course, to where they came from. In fact, their ties are strengthened. That is part of the reason they would bring them into the central administration. Later on, a lot of these people that would rise through the ranks would be children, but that would take time. So they would come in as, what does that mean? 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, that kind of thing. And then you try and figure out, they are converted, and then you teach them, you put them through the education system of the court. So they learn Turkish, obviously Persian, because that is the language of it's for a while it was the language of administration. But then it becomes the language of literature and poetry. So if you're a Renaissance man, no pun intended, you would have to have Persian and Arabic for legal. If you're going to go into law, right? So they would, and then you would train them in military, so they would be, and then you would split the very few that end up being Janissaries, Yeniçeri. So Janissaries in English, Yeniçeri is the right word to hit, which means the new army, so they are the ones that are the elite,
the
trained,
top of the class.
Yeah,
the Harvard of, the Cornell of that time.
Well, thank you, I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
So they are and they are the ones that you only send in at the end. Still, there was no such thing as a standing army for a long time. When there was standing armies, trained armies, that becomes that's when the Ottomans start to lose their military power. Because for them, they would call on some of their what do you call it? A lot of their armies would have different. They would send them to different kind of villages where they would rule over. Not rule. They would use the resources from the village, and then they're supposed to be called on by the central government when we're going into battle, and they'd bring in men with pitchforks and so, so they're just fodder that you would actually use as fighters. Janissaries are trained elite people you bring in at the end to finish things off. But the Janissaries, out of all of the Devshirme, which is the system of collecting, that's what they call them, like the harvesting. Only if you become Janissaries, the rest populate the administration. So they are the accountants and the lawyers and the religious figures and people that work in the court, people that are very close to the Sultan. Some of them work in his internal chamber, so they wash him and bathe him and all. So and all this, you basically, somebody is in charge of them as they grow up, and you figure out what is their strength. Are they more like physical? Is it mental? Is it something else? So they get divided up. But that means a lot of the rank and file are actually mostly Balkan. So that is absolutely true. Mostly Balkan. You usually go, Serbia has a disproportionate number from them, but Montenegro also as a Montenegrin, because they had this image that Montenegrins are big and broad and sturdy. They're mountain men.
Yeah, we still have that image in the Balkans, to be honest.
Right. So there is that is common. Now the whole thing with Devshirme really ends towards the end of the 17th century. By the beginning of the 18th century, it's gone. It cannot be justified. And also remember, there's no conquest happening after that, where the borders are established. So what are you going to go to your Ottoman villages that happen to be in it and collect kids? So that whole system falls apart. Also, the system is so strict that the Janissaries they can get married, but their privilege does not go to their kids.
Okay.
Right.
So it's not just like a feudal lord who would just pass or
no, nothing like that at all. They also get paid in salary. So
like professionals.
They're professionals. But later on, all of that falls apart for many reasons. Economic is one of them. Also, the devaluation of the currency. They're paid in coin that gets devaluated when the silver comes from the New World. There's so many complex that whole eliteness of the Janissaries that lasted for about 200 years really deteriorates very quickly. And then but they have established themselves now. They've changed the rules for themselves. There's so many of them that they become kind of enemy of the state, if you will. They're competing with the Sultan's authority. They like it's a whole other thing. And it takes about 100 years to get rid of them completely. Finally, with this like red wedding event in which they get
Love
rid
the
of,
reference.
They get rid of a whole bunch of them which only happens really in 1820.
Okay. Another institution that has always preoccupied the imagination of the Westerners, sometimes a little bit too much, especially the Orientalists in the 19th century, was the Ottoman Imperial Harem. But actually far from the cliched conception of the harem just being like a living space for sultans' wives and concubines, harems could wield quite a lot of political power, right, at times.
Very much. No, very much. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, even though I don't specialize in it. It's something that comes up a lot. And of course, the word harem has these, people get weird images in their head. Or not weird, depending on how you're into it, whatever. But let me break it down as much as I can.
Please.
And I rely heavily on Leslie Pierce's work, who is a historian, who did a great job. There are others. There are new work that's being done, but really, she kind of like nipped at this sexual fantasy but by talking about the harem as an institution, and it's an institution that has hierarchies, it has salaries, and a lot of power, a fascinating amount of power from within the walls. So yes, their mobility is actually it's restricted, but their interaction with power with the power with powerful pashas and viziers and of course the sultan, and their access to it allows them a lot more power than we imagined. And she kind of breaks it down in very interesting ways. So the harem, yes, there's a lot of concubines, enslaved people that come from, which is where the word white slavery, Slav, it comes from. So a lot of them are brought in from, they're bought from either Crimea, Crimea, the cause of a lot of has always been a very interesting place. A lot of the Tatar that left over from Tamerlane live there, and that's where they become kind of that's their. But they also were allied with the Ottoman Empire, and in many ways paid taxes. A lot of it is done with slaves. So they supplied the top of the most of the households that had concubines with the best, because they would raid neighboring areas in what is today Ukraine, and as well as Russia on the other side, all the way into Poland. So a lot of these women would be originally from, they're Ukrainian and Polish and whatever, and later on from Circassia. So they're Circassian. So every and Circassian slavery continues all the way into the 20th century.
Whoa.
Yes. So what does that mean? They are brought in the case of the palace. There's many of them. I don't know, but they are then they have to be divided into. Of course, there are some that sleep with the sultan. Their job is to produce an heir.
Yeah.
But there's the rest of them do everything else, right? Within this system, in which the head of this institution is the sultan's mother, who then dictates everything below her.
What was she called? She was called Sultan something, right?
Yeah, Valide Sultan.
Valide Sultan, yeah.
Queen mother. I don't know. That's as yeah. But what is interesting, what it's important to remember, is that by definition, the mother of the sultan was herself a slave.
Okay.
Right? Definition. Every mother of every sultan. Why? Because beyond the first couple of generations of Ottomans, when it was like the Emirate and all of like the beyliks, what you start to do is that you only marry for political, but the Sultan really does not. You do not have sex with the person you're married. You have sex with the concubines that are there to produce heirs. Once they produce an heir, a male heir specifically, and if the male heir is viable, which means he's not disabled in one way or another, you usually you send them along with the male heir to a province to rule over a province. In reality, the women are doing the ruling from the background, but it's in the name of their 12-year-old kid. Your job is to make sure that your kid, as opposed to all of the other kids of all of the other concubines, becomes the sultan. And because then you become the valid sultan, you become the queen mother, and then you rule over a lot of the internal dynamics within the palace. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very much an economic political system within this that confines, and the sultan. And by the way, who gets to choose who? It's usually about genetics. So you wanna try and find an concubine who is beautiful and healthy, so we'll have healthy, beautiful heirs. What beauty is now gets into colorism, right? Which is we remember the Ottomans come from Central Asia.
Then?
No. So Ottomans come from Central Asia, right? Like
when you mentioned colorism.
Oh, already then, what do I mean by colorism? I mean, she has to be, the reason they all come
Slavic lands.
from Slavic lands is because that is the notion of beauty, that there has to be white, like Snow White, so the sultans end up having blue eyes, and all the way till the end, right?
So they
There's
already had this notion of beauty back then.
Yes.
Oh, okay, okay. This is not
So
a
that's
modern
No,
thing.
no. It's a really controversial thing. Somebody's gonna write me an email. But
I apologize for that.
no, it's fine. An email is fine as long as I mean, it can get worse. But what's interesting is that yes, absolutely, the woman that the Sultan would produce an heir from right from the beginning, end up having to be what do you call it? White. They remember they are mixing into first the Byzantine royal court, but later on into the wider European notion of what royalty looks like. So they are very much part of a European orbit of royalty on a cultural level.
But why
Which
would they care what the Europeans of conceptions of beauty are? If they're
it's not.
they're doing their own thing, they're the Ottomans.
No, absolutely. So the Ottomans, that's a great question because by what I just said, people misinterpret this as me saying that they thought that Europe is better than them and they're trying to imitate it. Absolutely not. They were part of it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So they are part of the system, and they are part of it all the way till the end. So even when the Ottoman Empire is, it's considered like whatever, the sick man of Europe and all of that, and people think of it as the Ottomans are trying to imitate. The Ottomans have always been part of it. So the Europeans sometimes would imitate the fashions out of coming out of the court in the 17th and 18th century, out of the Ottoman court in the 17th and 18th century. And the Ottomans would adopt it. But this idea that we are all part of a very specific notion of what it means to be an imperial upper class across the continent. And they interact at that level. But this idea that then our offsprings have to look a specific way, and that is what beauty, more importantly, that is what Ottoman dynasty should look like, is very specific. And Ottoman dynasty is supposed to be this. They're essentially these what the people in the Arab world or in the Arabic speaking world would call Rum or Roman at that time, as opposed to Rum, which means Greek Orthodox. So they have this. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, did the Ottomans have a concept of race? Probably not,
That's
right?
Oh my God, what are you doing to me? That's gonna get me. Did they have a concept of race? Uh, I mean, you cannot talk about race without talking about racism,
Yeah.
because they're tied in a way that race only matters if there's racism. The construction of race is about the otherness,
Yeah.
right? So in the producing the race, you're
Yeah.
producing
Yeah.
whoever is
Yeah.
other to you. There is otherness in the Ottoman Empire. It operated very differently than it did in Western Europe, because its functionality of particularly during the colonial period worked very differently for the Ottomans. They were not, the Ottomans, even though they were trying to join kind of a modern colonial system in Africa, which is what I argue in my first book. It didn't manifest. So the notion of otherness that comes with blackness or whatever only really seeps into the Ottoman Empire very, very, very late. When I say late, and it operates in ways that are familiar to a Western audience.
Yeah.
Very late. So late 19th, early 20th century, when otherness comes with trying to reassess who the pureness of us, whatever it is, the pureness of Turk, pureness of Arab, pureness of Greek, pureness of Armenian. And in many ways, it's constructed against some other. In Turk, it's Arab or Black. Armenian, it is Turk. You know what I mean? There's this. But that happens very late in the time when the very notion of empire is falling apart.
But what did, like, before all of that, what did, I mean, when I was reading, it seemed like compared to medieval Europe, the Ottoman Empire was a very tolerant place.
Oh, it's compared to medieval Europe, 100%, and that's not a high.
Okay, probably compared to medieval Europe, everybody else looked very tolerant. But
no, you're absolutely right. And if we, I want to say, I'm worried about two things. When I start talking about the Ottoman tolerance, the word tolerance indicates power. So, and I really want this to be very clear. So, if you are tolerant of someone, that means you are
Hold the power.
tolerating.
Yeah.
Absolutely, you hold the power. So, absolutely, 100%, they were tolerant. But people, but from us, but the but who is an Ottoman is complicated. So there is, of course, the ruling, very thin dynasty on top, and people that were part of the ruling establishment, and they were mixed. So that with outside of the dynasty, the people that were part of that establishment, let's go into the 19th century because we're coming. So they're very mixed. So you will have Albanians and Armenians and Bulgarians and Arabs and all of that are part of. So who identifies as Ottoman, who is not part of the Ottoman dynasty, changes. But so it is mixed on top. Now, when if you're thinking about tolerance in terms of towards different religious groups, then it gets complicated. So what I mean by this is, yes, the state organized itself based on dividing up the population from its own perspective into specific, what they called millets, or let's call them nations. Usually traditionally when they got Istanbul, there was three defined millets, and they're a millet meaning Greek Orthodox, Jewish, and Armenian. They were the three that were considered the Ottoman other. So they were very much part of the system, but they were Christians, right, that have their own autonomy, but also have to pay jizya, a head tax, right? And there's rules that they have to follow that only are applied when the state itself is having some issue internally to show its power over the minorities, right? So that is tolerance, 100%. And then within those communities, they flourished. So if you, the flourishing of communities, particularly of the Jewish community and the Greek Orthodox community, is 100% happened. Now, I don't want, but that is how society operated, right? The state divides these people into those people, but on top of all of them are the people that need no definition, the Sunni Muslims.
The universal, right? Kind of.
The universal.
Yeah.
They are, yes, compared to other empires, honestly, all the way till the end. And I would argue that not even just compared to the British Empire, compared to the French Empire and how they treated other places, it's 100% night and day. Does that mean that discrimination did not happen? Does that mean that the difference was not highlighted? Of course not. Does that mean that horrible things did not happen towards the end of the empire? I am in no way, so horrible things in which those same millets that were us. So a millet, that what people mistake is that they think a millet means that it's a non-Ottoman. It is actually a specific kind of Ottoman. The problem is that when you have them designated as specific kind of Ottoman, when notions of nationalism and racism comes in, you can then target a specific millet.
I see. But would they have like their own schooling system and their own like judicial system? Oh my God. Okay.
That's very much. So so that is I'm telling you the 101 version, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Remember, the state, this is supposed to have kind of originated in the big cities near Istanbul, first in Istanbul, where that was defined, and you have someone on the head of each so if I'm the Sultan, I can choose. Of course, who would be the head of a specific community? Usually, it's the Greek Orthodox patriarch, like for the Rum that are called the Greek Orthodox, they're called Rum in Osman I, or the Jews or whatever. Now, when you go beyond the big cities where there's Ottoman presence and Ottoman administration, things become a lot more localized, and not necessarily as uniform. But yes, theoretically, the way I teach it when we're doing 101 is we say, yes, they have their own, their autonomous schooling system. So they learn their own language. The religion is taught. And as far as religious legal system is established, they can go to it. But the whole population has always the potential, the option of going to the state legal system, which is Hanafi Sunni.
Okay.
So if we're married and we cannot get married, we cannot get divorced because we're both, I don't know, Catholic. I can go to the and say he's, according to Islamic law, he's not keeping up my lifestyle the way I would like to.
That's
They can then divorce you. So
okay.
there is the system up. And the only place this is all for personal status issues, right? So things that are supposed to be about crimes against God or crimes against the state are always tried by the state. So what do I mean by this? Tax issues, that's the state. But also things like murder, that goes up. Do you understand what I mean? Like there are things like divorce, inheritance, schooling, marriage, that is, each community has its own control over it.
Okay. I'm sorry, we're jumping a little bit all over the place. During the so-called Golden Age of Suleiman the Magnificent, right? We have this immense flourishing of science and the arts, and it seems that the wealth from all over the world is just pouring into the empire. I picture Istanbul during that time as one of the richest and, I don't know, is it too much to say most progressive places on
Very
Earth?
much. It is not.
But what was life like for a commoner?
So what do you mean by in Istanbul?
At that time. If we step down from the court and, the Janissaries and all these institutions and stuff, do we have any insight into what was life like for, I don't know, a blacksmith or a tradesman or midwife?
So that's very interesting. We have very little, but we have some. It is surprisingly mobile and surprisingly multicultural. I use that term advisedly. So what I mean by this is that we have records basically from courts. This is where we get to the people, because everybody used the court system. And if you are doing things that if it's something about taxation or selling a land or something, you will show up in the official court system as opposed to the religious or the system. So from that, we can tell that a lot of the people were very mobile. So they would talk about themselves, even though it's very hard to get around with no technology. There is a sense of we're ruling over a big piece of land, a big part of Earth at that point, all the way from Hungary to Yemen, and people have that sensibility about them, particularly from the center. So they would talk about a case in which somebody from Albania had a beef with someone in Ankara or something. So it's actually, they interacted in ways that it's hard for us to imagine now.
Quite cosmopolitan, no?
Quite cosmopolitan, particularly in the big cities. They also spoke language. They spoke several languages because they didn't learn them in school. The literacy rate was very high. Like 99%, right? So people do not know what language they're speaking, but they would be written down into the court, where the dude would start with Greek and end with Turkish, or they would be mixed in a way that is in their locality. So if you're living in a neighborhood in which your gardener is from Montenegro, but your nanny is from somewhere else, you grow up with that mixture of languages that was actually quite common, but it's very local. So people they could communicate in ways that are very different than to our understanding of which community does what. The Ottoman Turkish it was only kind of a written language, if you will, and proper Turkish was only spoken at the very, very high level of society, and it's mostly for administrative reasons or with the royalty. Anatolian Turkish was very different than what we think of as Ottoman Turkish, and they tried after the end of the empire to revive Anatolian Turkish. Of course, languages develop very organically, and to cleanse them is really to mess with them completely, which is unfortunately what they did. So it's a very mixed society. The day-to-day is there is Greeks, and there are Turks and Armenians, but also Persians and Venetians and French people that live there, because it is the hub. It's like it's the center of the world. It's like going to, not New York anymore. New York is very boring now. I don't know. Give me a good city. Give me a good city that is
Berlin, of
actually
course, because I'm here.
Berlin, of course, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah,
Where there's a lot of activity that's happening, and also it has the reputation beyond the borders of the
yeah.
empire, as where culture happen, as where, if you want to learn new things, you go to. So read that. So when they're talking about the golden age, yes, the court is fabulous and taffeta everywhere, and there's diamonds and stuff. That is great, but the places like Istanbul, by then, I remember Mehmet II, when he conquered Istanbul. Istanbul was like a shadow of its former self,
Yeah.
right? It was he had to repopulate it. Had what he called kind of population reengineering, where he brought people with incentive and by force to engineer a specific kind of environment that has both Greeks and Armenians and Jews, and as well as Turkic, but that have very specific skills, and most importantly, international connections. So it will become a hub of an international network. That, by the time we get to Selim, which is there's Bayezid after him, and then there's Selim. When Suleiman, sorry, Bayezid, Selim the first, and then Suleiman. We have several generations and more than a century. It is an established global capital that's why we think so. The Golden Age is just it's like a capital that was built as a global capital becomes a global capital, and it manifests all the way down to the layers. Now, outside of the capital, it's a very different story. Very, very different
Of course,
story.
but I did ask you about Istanbul, to be fair.
Yeah.
I mean, if I have a choice 100 times, what would I choose? A London in the 15th century or Istanbul in the 15th century? I'm going to go Istanbul 100 times probably out of the 100.
100%. Honestly, I would choose Istanbul. I would choose Istanbul, period. But
Nice.
I'm a bit obsessed with Istanbul. But honestly, it's even in the worst of times. We're talking, the turmoil of the 18th century, whatever. It remains in different ways, kind of that it's connecting not just Europe with the East. It's connecting the South with the North, and that to me is fascinating. So I'm giving you a golden age, golden image. Let me just put in the caveat that within that society, of course, for this to operate, just like any imperial capital, you're collecting a lot of taxes from a lot of people, and a lot of it is free labor. Just like when you go to London, I tell my students, like, London is beautiful. Guess where the money comes from?
Of course.
Colonies.
Hashtag colonies. Yeah.
Exactly. Or in an empire where your first thing is to make sure that the capital is well fed and organized, is where that is the goal of the economy at a certain extent. Of course, we'll produce a golden place. How do people feel about it, whether it's in the Balkans or in Anatolia or somewhere else, is a very, very different
Yeah,
story.
I recently visited Lisbon for the first time, and it was beautiful. But there were little reminders of where this wealth came from on every corner.
Of course, unfortunately, when you're a historian, particularly a historian of empire, it's very hard to just be like, hey, I went to Prague the other day. I was like, oh, Jesus. Like, all I could see is pillaging, which is terrible. It just ruins everything.
Yeah. I believe that. We're rushing a little bit. I know you don't have so much time left. Just two more questions. Jumping centuries again, but what were some of the major reasons for the eventual decline of the Ottoman Empire? I know it's a huge question, and I'm sorry to do this to you.
No, it is. I don't want to be an annoying guy, but I wanna try and get rid of the word decline, because decline assumes a
That's fair.
specific, like, it slowly went away,
Yeah,
and I'm
yeah.
just use it for the Roman Empire or whatever. But it's like, when maybe now we can talk about the decline of, maybe not. The reason I'm saying this is because it is there was no one way down moment. Like, there was no pivot that way we.
I recently had a historian of ancient Rome on the podcast, and she said there was no fall of the Roman Empire. It was a gradual decline. But maybe
See,
even this word is not useful in this context anymore.
no, not in this context, and I understand why they do it in the Roman Empire. We know a lot more about how things. I mean, just because they're different times, we know a lot more about what was happening with the Ottomans than we do with the
Of
Romans. So
course.
it's easier to draw like a nice kind of a story arc in which there's like the climax and when. For the Ottoman Empire, it is much more difficult to do that. In fact, it's not useful at all. And part of the reason it's not useful at all is because you start to do nothing after Suleiman the Magnificent, but look for reasons for decline as a research question. And of course, if you look for it, you will find it. But then, the reality is that there were good times and there were bad times, and then there were good times and there were bad times, and it depends on what you define as good and bad, right? Um, Expansion stops, but the provinces flourish. So is expansion the measure for whether it's in the ascend or descend? They're losing territories, but they're also reforming in it's really fascinating ways, which is the period I work on. So 19th century is fascinating. There's good and bad, but it is like any other political entity. It's moving in a direction that is very familiar, which is kind of it becomes more of a nation empire that is thinking of its subjects in a very new way. So the subjects become citizen subjects. So all of these things we would miss if we're thinking of it as let's look for all of the signs that actually fell apart. So by the time that we hit World War One, the empire is in debt. They have been in debt for a long time. I mean, they're bankrupt. By really the late 19th century, we're talking the 1870s, it's bankrupt, and the very so the British and the French, but also the Austrians and sometimes others would come in and they would try to service the debt of their own citizens from the budget of the empire before it goes to the empire. So that causes an erosion of sovereignty within. If you can't control your own budget within the empire, that is an erosion of sovereignty. There's also a concerted effort from European powers to redefine the Ottoman Empire as a non-civilized empire.
Mm-hmm.
That is a legal term in which the sovereignty of this European empire, it's part of the concert of Europe, is then questioned as being not legally applicable to it. So they start to take little chunks of land out of it, and there's legal justifications for it, even though it is supposed to be protected by law, by international law. So there's external pressures that are happening, but also internally, the things that are happening in a multinational empire, which it is. If we think of Millet as a nation, a lot of external pressures and internal pressures about that one different forms of political representation, whether it is autonomy, whether it is complete separation, starts to come in, and that slowly kind of carves out some of the sovereignty of the dynasty. All of this assuming an empire is a dynasty, and it becomes more complicated in the 19th century. An empire is it becomes an empire and a state, right? It's beyond its dynasty. By the time we hit World War One, surprisingly, it is still very viable in the same way that the Russian Empire was viable, and the same way that the Habsburg Empire was viable, which means there's a lot of you can easily talk about its weakness militarily, its weakness economically, but there was no understanding of it disappearing within 4 years. But World War One did it, the ultimate outcome was not predetermined as we would like to think of the empire falling and then being kind of carved up into
So
nation
similarly,
states.
like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Tsarist Russia also didn't anticipate that it's going to disappear in the course of one war.
Absolutely, and people. So again, I hate to go back to the book because it's my.
Please do.
That's what.
Yeah.
It is. So I follow 40 years of imperial family that was not Turkish,
Arab-Ottoman, right?
Arab Ottomans. Yeah, I call them Arab Ottoman, which is it's like which means they're from an Arab or Arabic-speaking part of the empire, but they're distinctly not non-Turk. They're not Turkish, and that they go through that period of being part of an imperial nation, if you will. Of course, they're elites. Of course, they can claim all of it, good, bad, and ugly, and try to. They think of imperialism as a strength rather than oppression. But they were part of this, and then it's within, I would say, 5 or even 7 years where things change very, very quickly, and their notion of who they are and what they belong to falls apart, even though they're right at the center. So we might want to think of it in retrospect like as a decline of 3 centuries. It really, the way it's experienced is a quick and traumatic, very traumatic for a lot of people, and that generation that went through that transition from being part of an empire, whether they are in Beirut or in Istanbul, is really traumatic. And then they're disconnected from. There's for the nation state that was created afterwards. There was a concerted effort to disconnect people from their history, again, of imperialism. So it's not really
sounds
funny.
familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, and that I really think is it's psychologically, generationally, like it's just you have no control over your history or knowledge of your history, and it's the generation that lived through that transition is a traumatized generation, and then the generations that came afterwards really they're disconnected from what. Again, their past, whether they like it or not, which causes a lot of the problems, I think, that many of the generations in the Arab world and in Turkey, because experience. And this disconnection from people around you, suddenly people that were part of the same unit become the other. It's detrimental to the whole region, and it's fundamental to the way we understand some of the conflicts that are happening there. But we don't understand it because we don't study the history and the period of transition.
Okay, the time is here to conclude, sadly, because this was an absolutely awesome conversation. But the title of this podcast is Eurotrash, which means I have to ask you something a bit more trashy at the end, of course. These days in the Balkans, we've been conquered again, but this time with Turkish soap operas, especially about the Ottomans.
Yes.
Like, people are literally fainting in shopping centers with one of these actors appear there. It's impossible to ignore, they have whole tours of the Balkans and all that stuff. It's everywhere. Do you maybe have a favorite one, just as a guilty pleasure?
Oh no, I honestly, I've tried. So
I've tried. Okay, I think that's the answer already.
No. I mean, Hürrem Sultan. I mean, I sound like Hürrem Sultan when I speak Turkish because people made fun of me. I sound like a Turk who grew up in Germany, which which is what Hürrem Sultan is, or the actress is. So we used to, when that first came out, it was like a big deal, and we would like get together. It was on a Wednesday. With the commercials, it would go on the whole night. It was a lot of fun.
Which one are you talking about?
The very, very first one, Muhtasham Yüzyıl.
The English title. You don't know the English title.
English title.
Was it the Magnificent Century? Is that the one? Yeah.
And so that was the first one, and I thought, and I still use clips from that show in my class, not as a way of talking about our imagination of or our perception of the past and how it's used today in Turkey. It becomes a lot more politicized. I don't know. I mean, it's all propaganda, of course. Everything is, but the ones that came after that were just so explicitly, for a historian, are just so explicitly about today rather than what happened then. It becomes very difficult to watch, and it really is difficult to see my mother like fawning over them and taking them as history, because you just stop at one point. You just go like, all right, fine, So I find it hard to watch.
Okay.
Yeah.
I recently had a Viking historian on the podcast, and I asked him about the TV show Vikings, and he had a very similar reaction that you're having to these Ottoman soap operas. So maybe, the authors should become a little bit more creative. Professor Minawi, where can people find your book, Losing Istanbul?
Oh, thank you. That's for that. So they can find it on Amazon or through Stanford or anywhere that English books are sold. It's also you can get it as a. I mean, I shouldn't really plug that. No, you
Why
can.
not?
No, because it's I shouldn't. It's literally illegal.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow.
But if you want to buy it,
Yes.
I would encourage you to buy it, at least for the first year, just because. Yeah, it's really anywhere you can buy. Amazon is big in Germany, and
Yep.
but in Turkey, there are other similar, like you can get it through Getir if if you want. So it's really available everywhere. At least in Europe and North America. Now, for when we go into the Arab world, it becomes a little more complicated. Just because of the access to. So I am working very hard on getting it translated into Arabic. It took me way too long to translate the first book into Arabic, and it's coming out in December. So this one, I want to have it translated into Arabic and available through Arabic, in particularly in North Africa and the rest of the Arab world soon. Turkish translation, I will have to pause on for now because the first one got translated into Turkish and all hell broke loose. So
Oh, wow.
I'll wait a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Good luck. Where can people follow you on social media, websites, Twitter,
Yeah,
Instagram?
I'm at Mostafa Minawi at Twitter. Please follow me on Twitter. Do not request Facebook French. If I don't know you, I will not accept you on Facebook, which has been happening a lot recently. And I'm like, just go on Twitter. So it's Mostafa Minawi, at Mostafa Minawi, Mostafa Minawi. Also, that's the best place to actually follow me because that's where I put most of the stuff related to work and news and analysis about what's happening in the region, Turkey and Lebanon and Syria and so on.
Professor Minawi, thanks again. This was absolutely amazing. I hope we can do this in the future again sometime.
I hope to. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.